Before we go any further, viewer discretion is strongly advised. What you are about to hear is not merely a television segment or a heated exchange between a host and a guest. It is the collision of two fundamentally different worlds. This is the story of what happens when a soldier who has spent years facing real enemies on foreign soil walks into a brightly lit television studio and is confronted not with bullets or bombs, but with character assassination and ideological warfare. What happens when someone trained in discipline, restraint, and honor is forced to engage with a media personality whose primary weapon is outrage, and what happens when that outrage finally fails? At the center of this confrontation stood Joy Behar, long regarded as the self-appointed queen of televised indignation. For years, she has thrived in an environment where mockery substitutes for argument and interruptions replace dialogue. Her platform, The View, has carefully cultivated an atmosphere that presents itself as discussion, but often functions more like a public trial. Guests are summoned, not to exchange ideas, but to be judged. Some are welcomed as ideological allies and treated with reverence. Others are marked as enemies and subjected to ridicule, suspicion, and moral condemnation. Across from her sat a woman who did not fit neatly into any of those categories. Tulsi Gabbard did not enter the studio as a celebrity seeking validation or as a politician nervously courting approval. She walked in with the calm, deliberate composure of a military officer accustomed to hostile environments. With 16 years of service in the Army National Guard, including deployments overseas, Tulsi carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already endured far worse than sharp words and raised eyebrows. This was not her first battlefield. It was simply a different kind. The narrative surrounding Tulsi Gabbard had already been written long before she took her seat at the table. She was portrayed as an outsider, a renegade, a Democrat who refused to follow party orders. Worse, she had been branded with one of the most damaging accusations in modern American politics, that she was somehow aligned with foreign adversaries. The words Russian asset had been casually thrown into public discourse, repeated often enough that suspicion replaced evidence. Joy Behar herself had amplified these claims, contributing to a smear campaign that relied more on innuendo than fact. On that day, Joy believed she was prepared. Weeks of talking points, rehearsed angles, and applause. Ready lines had sharpened her confidence. She expected another compliant guest, or at worst, a flustered politician scrambling to defend herself. What she did not anticipate was resistance. Not loud, emotional resistance, but something far more dangerous: composure. Tulsi wore white, a subtle but powerful visual contrast to the muddy accusations being hurled in her direction. It was a symbolic choice, signaling clarity against confusion, discipline against chaos. As the studio lights shone and the audience settled into their seats, the atmosphere felt less like a talk show and more like a staged spectacle. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, primed for confrontation. They had been fed the storyline for months. This was the problem Democrat, the one Hillary Clinton had warned them about, the one who dared to criticize her own party's leadership and foreign policy decisions. Joy Behar opened the discussion not with a direct accusation, but with a calculated deflection. She steered the conversation toward Donald Trump, a familiar pressure point designed to force Tulsi into an impossible choice. If Tulsi criticized the president, she would satisfy the table but betray her own stated principles. If she defended him on any point, she would confirm the suspicions already planted in the audience's mind. It was a trap disguised as a question. Joy's voice dripped with skepticism as she framed Tulsi as being more skeptical than a lot of Democrats about the impeachment inquiry. The implication was clear: skepticism equaled disloyalty. Independent thought was treated not as a virtue, but as evidence of corruption. The table leaned in, waiting for the stumble, the hesitation, the moment where Tulsi would crack under the weight of the accusation. But it never came. Instead of reacting emotionally, Tulsi responded with measured clarity. She did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt. She did not retreat. She calmly dismantled the premise of the question, refusing to accept the false choice laid out before her. Her discipline rendered mockery ineffective. Her refusal to play the expected role disrupted the rhythm Joy relied on so heavily. What unfolded was not a debate in the traditional sense. It was something closer to a live, unscripted exposure. The tactics that had worked so effectively against other guests, interruption, ridicule, moral superiority, fell flat against someone trained to remain steady under pressure. Joy's attempts to regain control only highlighted the imbalance. The more she pushed, the more apparent it became that she was unprepared for a guest who would not be intimidated. This was not a shouting match. There was no dramatic walk-off, no theatrical meltdown. Instead, there was something far more unsettling for a host accustomed to dominance, a calm refusal to be smeared. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. The tribunal lost its authority. The bully lost her leverage. For viewers watching at home, the effect was unmistakable. This was not a politician being exposed. It was a media figure confronted with the consequences of reckless accusations. The weapons of mockery and interruption proved useless against military, raid discipline. The script failed. The applause cues fell silent. What happened that day on The View was not simply an uncomfortable exchange. It was a rare moment when the machinery of televised outrage malfunctioned. A woman who had spent years serving her country stood her ground against a system that thrives on distortion, and in doing so, revealed its fragility. This was not a debate. It was not even an argument. It was, as many would later describe it, a dismantling, performed live, under studio lights, for millions to see. The question was delivered with the kind of implied judgment that The View had perfected over the years. "Were you surprised by what he did yesterday?" Joy Behar asked, her tone carefully calibrated to sound casual while carrying a loaded assumption beneath it. The bait dangled openly in the air. It was a familiar maneuver, one the show had relied on countless times before, a classic View tactic designed to force the guest into step with the host's narrative. Answer incorrectly, and the verdict would already be decided. Joy leaned back in her chair, confident, almost relaxed. In her mind, the sequence was already mapped out. Tulsi Gabbard would take the bait. She would launch into a long, defensive explanation about impeachment, drowning herself in procedural language and legal nuance. That would be the opening Joy needed. Once the guest was sufficiently entangled, the real ambush would come. Accusations, interruptions, knowing smirks, and applause lines delivered with surgical precision. Around the table, the other hosts watched attentively, poised like predators waiting for the signal to strike. The atmosphere in the studio grew heavy, thick with the unspoken demand for conformity. This was the ritual. Say the line, play your role, attack the orange man, perform loyalty, be a good Democrat. But something went wrong. Tulsi Gabbard did not move. She didn't shift uncomfortably in her seat. She didn't glance sideways for reassurance. Her eyes did not dart around the table, searching for approval or calculating how to survive the next 30 seconds. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her posture composed, her presence grounded. When she looked up, she looked directly at Joy Behar, and in that gaze there was no fear. There was something else entirely. It was the look of a soldier assessing a threat, calm, focused, analytical, not emotional, not reactive. This was not the gaze of someone caught off guard. It was the gaze of someone who had already decided how the encounter would end. "Ah, well, look, the facts are important," Tulsi said at last. Her voice was steady, unhurried, almost dismissive. The bait was brushed aside as casually as a cobweb. She wasn't there to speculate about what the president did yesterday. She wasn't there to perform outrage on command or play pundit for Joy Behar's amusement. She was there for one reason only, to clear her name. In that moment, the carefully constructed setup began to unravel. Joy sensed it immediately. Years of experience told her the rhythm was off. The guest was not following the script. She tried to interrupt, tried to redirect, tried to steer the conversation back toward the rock she had chosen for the collision. But the momentum had shifted, and there was no pulling it back. The mouse had brought a grenade. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 20 degrees in a single second. What had moments earlier felt like a controlled environment suddenly turned cold and uncertain. Tulsi Gabbard had stopped playing the game. The usual tools, interruption, mockery, framing, were suddenly ineffective, and we'll get to that. Tulsi continued, dismissing Joy's impeachment question as if it were a footnote rather than the headline. "I want to start with something that I think is also important, about facts." Joy Behar froze. She knew exactly what was coming. Joy was not new to this. She was a veteran of the format, a master of controlling conversations and shaping outcomes. She could smell danger when it entered the room, and in that instant, she realized the power dynamic had flipped. The conversation was no longer hers to command. Tulsi wasn't reacting anymore. She was advancing. The studio audience, trained by years of predictable exchanges, fell unusually quiet. There was no applause cue, no laughter line, no comfortable release of tension. This was unfamiliar territory. This was not a guest begging for acceptance or scrambling to explain herself. This was a woman calmly reclaiming the narrative, refusing to accept the premise of the attack. Joy's face betrayed the slightest flicker of recognition, an understanding that this moment was different. The smear she had relied on, repeated and reinforced through implication rather than evidence, was about to be addressed directly, and that was the one thing the format was never designed to handle. Tulsi's discipline made interruption look petty. Her restraint made mockery seem hollow. Every attempt to rush her only highlighted the imbalance. She spoke not with the urgency of someone defending a position, but with the certainty of someone correcting the record. This was no longer about Donald Trump. It was no longer about impeachment. It was about accountability, about the reckless ease with which reputations are damaged in the age of sound bites and applause-driven outrage. The other hosts shifted in their seats, sensing the shift, but unsure how to respond. The usual chorus was absent. The tribunal had lost its rhythm. The audience wasn't being told how to feel, and without that guidance, they simply watched. What unfolded next was not loud. It was not explosive in the way daytime television often is. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic walk-offs. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: control slipping quietly from the hands of someone accustomed to absolute dominance. Joy Behar had built her authority on momentum, on never letting a guest finish a thought, on framing questions so tightly that escape seemed impossible. But Tulsi had stepped outside the frame entirely. She refused to be cornered, refused to be caricatured, refused to be reduced to a talking point. For the first time in a long time, the show's most seasoned interrogator was forced to listen, and in that silence, the imbalance was exposed. This was not a debate. It wasn't even a confrontation in the traditional sense. It was a moment where the machinery of televised conformity stalled, confronted by someone who would not submit to it. A soldier trained to remain steady under fire had just introduced a variable the system couldn't neutralize. The game was over, and Joy Behar knew it. Joy Behar knew the moment slipping through her fingers the instant she felt it. Years on live television had trained her instincts well. She knew when a guest was about to break, and she knew when she herself was about to lose control. This was the latter. Panic flickered briefly behind her glasses, just a flash but enough. The mask of confidence cracked. She tried to cut Tulsi off, to reclaim the floor, to reassert the illusion that she was still the one steering the conversation. "I was just going to get to that," Joy stammered, her voice rising as she attempted to talk over her guest. "Good, yeah, helping you out, helping you out." The condescension was unmistakable. Joy was no longer debating. She was scrambling. She tried to reframe the ambush as an act of generosity, as though she were doing Tulsi a favor by finally addressing the smears that had been circulating for months. It was a familiar maneuver: turn accusation into assistance, hostility into concern. Let the audience believe the host was benevolent, even as the blade was already halfway in. But Tulsi Gabbard was not looking for help. She was looking for accountability. Joy's interruption hit her like paper against steel. Tulsi didn't pause. She didn't flinch. She drove straight through it, like a tank through a picket fence, her focus unbroken. The more Joy tried to interrupt, the more exposed she became. Control was no longer slipping. It was gone. "You want me to ask you the question?" Joy asked nervously, her tone shifting as she tried to reclaim her role as inquisitor, as judge, as the one who decided who spoke and when. "Look," Tulsi said firmly. One word, that was all it took. The command cut through the noise and silenced the host instantly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, authoritative, unmistakable. The kind of command that does not ask for permission. The kind that expects obedience. "Some of you have accused me of being a traitor to my country." The words landed heavily in the studio, hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. There was no way to soften them. No way to spin them, ugly, direct, undeniable, traitor. There are few accusations more severe, especially against someone who has worn the uniform. For a soldier, it is not just an insult. It is the ultimate betrayal of identity, honor, and sacrifice. It is the highest crime one can be accused of without a trial. Tulsi continued, her voice steady as she listed the labels that had been casually tossed around, often from this very table, often with laughter, often without consequence. A Russian asset, a Trojan horse, a foreign puppet hiding in plain sight, and a useful idiot, she added, pausing just long enough to let the phrase sink in. I think that was the term that you used. Her eyes locked directly onto Joy Behar's. There was no hostility in the gaze, only precision. Tulsi didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse emotionally. She simply named the words and placed responsibility exactly where it belonged. Then she did something devastating. She defined the term. She stripped away the political jargon and explained it plainly for the audience, reducing the smear to its core meaning. That basically means that I'm naive, she said, or that I lack the intelligence to understand what's really going on. The insult, once dressed up as clever commentary, was suddenly naked. Joy Behar shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The confidence she had carried into the segment evaporated. The room felt smaller now, tighter. The audience, normally loud, reactive, and eager, fell into a rare and uncomfortable silence. It is easy to call someone a useful idiot when they are just a face on a screen. It is easy when they are reduced to a caricature, a headline, a talking point. It is much harder to do it face to face, much harder when that person has been deployed to war zones, has worn the uniform, has sworn an oath that most people in the room never have. The silence wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was the natural response of people realizing they were watching something they weren't supposed to see. The consequences of reckless words. Tulsi did not rush to fill the silence. She let it breathe, let it weigh on the room, let the audience sit with the reality of what had been said about her, and who had said it. Joy had no interruption ready this time, no joke, no applause line, no quick pivot to save face. The usual tools were useless. The audience wasn't laughing. The hosts weren't chiming in. The tribunal had lost its authority. This was no longer a performance. It was a reckoning. Tulsi wasn't there to argue ideology. She wasn't there to defend a party or attack another. She was there to confront something deeper and far more uncomfortable, the casual destruction of reputations, the ease with which accusations are thrown, and the arrogance of believing there will never be consequences. The accusation of treason had been made lightly. Tulsi was forcing it to be taken seriously. In that moment, the power imbalance that had defined the view for years inverted. The host who thrived on control was exposed as vulnerable. The guest who was supposed to be on defense had taken command, and everyone in the room knew it. This was not a shouting match. There was no chaos, no breakdown, no spectacle in the traditional sense. Instead, there was something far more damning, calm accountability in a space built to avoid it. Joy Behar had lost the floor. And Tulsi Gabbard had taken it, not with outrage, not with theatrics, but with discipline, precision, and the quiet authority of someone who refused to let lies stand unchallenged. The studio remained silent, and for once, silence spoke louder than applause. Tulsi Gabbard's voice rose, not in anger, but with the unmistakable authority of rank. This was not the volume of someone shouting to be heard. It was the projection of someone accustomed to giving orders that must be followed. The studio, already tense, seemed to stiffen under the weight of her words. I am a patriot, she declared. The statement landed with force, not because it was loud, but because it was unequivocal. No qualifiers. No hedging, no apology. In a room built on insinuation and doubt, Tulsi spoke in absolutes. I love our country, she continued, reclaiming the narrative that had been twisted and weaponized against her. I am a strong and intelligent woman of color. That phrase alone shattered multiple frames at once. It refused the caricature she had been assigned. It dismantled the lazy labels. It confronted the unspoken assumptions behind the attacks. Tulsi was no pawn, no outsider, no naive participant in someone else's agenda. She named herself on her own terms, and I have dedicated almost my entire adult life," she said, her voice steady but resolute, "to protecting the safety, security, and freedom of all Americans in this country." This was no rhetorical flourish. This was a record. 16 years in uniform, deployments, service, sacrifice, the kind of commitment that cannot be manufactured in a studio green room. Then she invoked the ground no one in that room could casually dismiss. It was after the attacks of September 11th. The words cut through the air like a blade. Joy Behar recoiled almost instinctively. She couldn't let Tulsi finish. If Tulsi established her patriotism fully, if she anchored it in 9/11, in service, in sacrifice, the smears would evaporate on contact. The entire premise of the ambush would collapse. Joy needed to muddy the waters again, immediately. "Well, I guess we're getting a little bit far ahead of ourselves." Joy stammered, trying desperately to interrupt the momentum, to break Tulsi's rhythm before it solidified into something unassailable. The interruption wasn't subtle, it wasn't elegant, it was panic disguised as moderation. And then Joy reached for a different weapon. If she couldn't prove Tulsi was a Russian asset, she would prove she was something equally unforgivable in the culture of the View, ideologically adjacent to conservatives. Guilt by association. But Joy sneered, "Franklin Graham finds you refreshing." The name hit the table like a dead rat. Franklin Graham, the conservative evangelical leader, was not introduced as a fact, but as a contamination. Joy delivered it with a smirk, as if the mere mention should be enough to discredit everything Tulsi had just said. "He doesn't find me refreshing." Tulsi shot back, not missing a beat, but Joy wasn't done. She escalated. She reached for the nuclear option of character assassination, the kind that doesn't argue policy or principle, but poisons the well so thoroughly that no defense seems possible. "Richard Spencer," Joy announced dramatically, "the white nationalist leader, says he could vote for you." The room reacted instantly, gasps, murmurs, a sharp intake of breath. Joy was playing to the crowd now, counting on the emotional reflex. It was a low blowed, deliberate and reckless, connecting a woman of color to a known white nationalist based on nothing more than a reported, unwanted endorsement. It didn't matter that Tulsi had never sought it. It didn't matter that she had rejected hate consistently. It didn't matter that endorsements cannot be controlled. The implication was enough. The trigger had been pulled. The war was no longer cold. It was hot. Joy Behar had realized the Russian label wasn't sticking, so she threw everything else she had at the wall. Evangelicals, conservatives, cable news hosts, white nationalists. Anyone whose name could provoke disgust in the audience became ammunition. Tucker Carlson, Franklin Graham, Richard Spencer. Each name was meant to bury Tulsi deeper, to overwhelm her with association until she collapsed under the weight of other people's opinions. But as Joy rattled off those names, convinced she was winning, she failed to notice one crucial thing. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't flinching. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't scrambling. She wasn't defending herself emotionally. She was reloading. The soldier had survived the ambush. She had identified the enemy's position, assessed the tactics, and recognized the shift in strategy. This was no longer about smears. It was about desperation. Joy's voice grew sharper, faster, less controlled. The calm authority she had started with was gone, replaced by frantic escalation. She was throwing punches now, hoping one would land. Tulsi, meanwhile, remained grounded. Her posture didn't change. Her eyes stayed locked forward. This was not unfamiliar territory for her. Chaos, accusations, psychological warfare. She had trained for this kind of pressure, not in studios, but in far more dangerous places. What Joy mistook for vulnerability was discipline. What the audience mistook for silence was restraint. Tulsi understood something Joy didn't. When someone starts throwing everything at you at once, it means they're running out of options. The smears had failed, the interruptions had failed, the audience manipulation had failed. Now Joy was exposed, reduced to stacking associations instead of making arguments, and Tulsi was ready. She had absorbed the attack. She had let the host exhaust herself, and now, with the battlefield clearly mapped, she was preparing to return fire, not recklessly, not emotionally, but with precision. The studio could feel it. This wasn't over. It was just entering its next phase.